Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. This video is another historical one with a ripping story and some quite interesting lessons about hung parliaments, the reserve powers of the state governor, the importance of knowing your parliamentary procedure, the perils of sleeping in the house in Parliament, and of course the need to tie up your shoelaces before you walk downstairs. It concerns the dramas that afflicted the first Labor government in New South Wales. It was elected to office on the 14th of October 1910 with a majority of 2. Once it had provided the Speaker, however, it had a fragile majority of 1 on the floor of the House. But the Premier, James McGowan, still felt sufficiently confident of his government's survival to head off on the very long journey to the United Kingdom for the coronation of King George V. This was because he had a pairing arrangement with the opposition, which meant that an opposition member would refrain from voting so that they cancelled out each other's votes and it would not affect the government's majority. William Holman was left in charge as acting Premier, and all went well until he tried to implement Labor's policy of preventing rural leases from being converted into freehold. This caused great concern amongst the country Labor members and the independents. In the middle of a censure vote against the government, which Holman was confident of surviving, he was handed the resignation of 2 country Labor members. This meant his majority had walked out on him. Fortunately for Holman, they had arranged pairs for that particular vote. Holman was also aided by the fact that an opposition member had fallen asleep in the chamber and was counted as voting with the government in an important vote because of the side of the chamber on which he slept. The Labor government survived the censure vote, but could not rely on letting sleeping members lie as a strategy for the future. Holman wanted the House to adjourn for a month until the 2 by-elections were held, but he just didn't have the numbers to get the vote through. He hatched a plan to ask the Lieutenant Governor, who was filling in for the Governor, and on this see my previous video about the chain of command, to prorogue the House, which effectively means to suspend its operation until the by-elections were over. But Holman knew that the Lieutenant Governor had a reserve power to refuse his advice to prorogue. So he prepared a plan B, which was rather drastic. It was to resign on behalf of the government, but conditional upon a new government being able to be formed. Holman was banking on the opposition under Charles Wade not being able to form a government either. He also thought that the Lieutenant Governor would prefer to grant the prorogation of Parliament to an undefeated government rather than to grant a prorogation or a dissolution to an opposition which has never held the confidence of the House. Besides, if his side won the by-elections, then Holman would be able to defeat the new government in a confidence motion. The plan, however, depended upon Holman's government remaining undefeated even though he had a minority on the floor of the House. So Holman told his backbenchers to keep asking questions to ministers in question time, which in those days had no time limit, and he told his ministers to filibuster, that is, to keep going on and on and on in their answers, dragging it out, while Holman jumped in what he described as a quick car and sped to Government House to seek the prorogation or to resign before he could be defeated. As his ministers gave long, tedious answers in the chamber about tick control regulations and the state cement works, Holman asked the Lieutenant Governor, Sir William Cullen, to prorogue Parliament until the by-elections were held. Cullen, who was also the Chief Justice of New South Wales, exercised his reserve power to refuse the prorogation request. Holman then tried to resign, but the Lieutenant Governor insisted on discussing the matter over afternoon tea. It was only after the teacups had been cleared away that Holman managed to escape, driving as fast as he possibly could back to Parliament House. He then burst into the House, where his ministers were still flailing around on very tedious answers to questions, and announced that the government had resigned. Holman later said that his statement, quote, fell like a thunderbolt on the opposition, resulting in real, unpretended stupefaction, unquote. The opposition leader, Charles Wade, argued that Holman couldn't resign on behalf of the government, as only the Premier could do that, and the Premier was half a world away in the United Kingdom. Holman declared that his resignation was as effective as any resignation ever was, except that it was subject to an alternative government being formed. Now, this remains a practice today. Whenever a government resigns in Australia, its resignation does not take effect immediately. In fact, it only takes effect once the new government is about to be sworn in, so there's no gap during which there are no ministers in office. Labor's other tactic was to get the Speaker to resign on grounds of ill health. This meant that if Wade was to form a government, he'd have to provide his own Speaker, and then his party would also be in minority, just as Holman's Labor Party had been. Wade did try to form a government, but he asked the Lieutenant Governor for a guarantee that he would be granted a dissolution of Parliament and a fresh election if he could not control the House. The Lieutenant Governor refused to give such a guarantee. A general election had only recently been held, so it was not appropriate at that stage to hold a new one. It was also a vice-regal reserve power to refuse a dissolution of Parliament. As Wade was unable to form a government that could command the confidence of the lower house, the Lieutenant Governor returned to Holman and agreed to prorogue the House, as he had originally requested. Holman's resignation, therefore, never took effect because it was conditional upon a new government being formed. But Wade could not form a new government. Hence, Holman's gamble had paid off. The by-elections, however, did not resolve Holman's political problems. Labor won one and the opposition won the other one. So Labor managed to convince a Liberal member, Henry Willis, to become the Speaker. When Labor nominated Willis, the opposition was outraged. It realised that the election of the Speaker takes place under the supervision of the clerk, who has no power to discipline members, maintain order, or terminate debate. So, the opposition embarked on a strategy of unmitigated abuse that went all night long. Now, the intent of this was to pressure Willis to recant or to get the Lieutenant Governor to intervene and require a dissolution be held. One of Holman's backbenchers, however, reading through the standing orders late that evening, realised that the opposition had made an error in not proposing an alternative candidate to be Speaker. Where there was only one candidate, the standing orders permitted him to be called to the chair without a vote and conducted there by the members who proposed and seconded his nomination. On making this procedural discovery in the early hours of the morning, Holman was anxious to implement his coup before the opposition woke up, literally as well as metaphorically, and nominated an alternative candidate. The only problem was that the members who had proposed and seconded Willis had wandered off somewhere in Parliament House for a sleep. It was the middle of the night. Holman spent the next few hours peering into all the rooms around Parliament House, looking for the crucial slumbering members while trying not to alert anyone's suspicions. When at last he found them, he arranged for them to saunter into the chamber separately and take up positions near Willis. At 7:30 a.m, when only a few opposition members were in the chamber, another Labor member got the call to speak, and he deliberately paused, ostensibly to pour himself some water prior to speaking. During that momentary silence, a stage army of Labor members all bawled out "Willis" in unison, calling him to the chair. He was promptly dragged a short distance by his nominators and seated in the Speaker's chair before the opposition realised what was happening. As Holman later recounted, quote, "For the moment, a wild idea of resisting this occupancy of the chair by physical force was evidently contemplated by some of the members of the opposition. But we had thoughtfully planted around the step of the chair some members of our own party, who by their physical dimension and corporeal weight were qualified to discourage any effort of that kind, and after a moment it was dropped." Unquote. The consequence was a rowdy parliament and the escalation of disruption and disorder. On the 20th of September 1911, the Sydney Morning Herald reported on, quote, "Pandemonium in Parliament," unquote. As the Herald described it, tensions in the House were high as the opposition sought to criticise the Speaker for referring to them in a speech in his electorate as a pack of ruffians. Tough language. Crowds descended on the public gallery, quote, "on the tiptoe of excitement and expectation, waiting for the verbal storm to burst," unquote. They were not disappointed. The Speaker had disallowed all questions about his prior statements, frustrating the opposition. He then named an opposition member, which means that he's required to leave at the chamber, so Mr. Cohen, who the Herald reported had been sitting most inoffensively in his seat. The Sergeant-at-Arms was called upon to remove Cohen, but a number of members, being, quote, "of large stature and weight," unquote, closed in around him and prevented the Sergeant and the House messengers from removing him. The Speaker left the chair, with, quote, "harmless paper missiles," unquote, being thrown in his wake, and the House adjourned for half an hour to allow the parties to cool off. When the Speaker returned, he was prepared for battle. After a little debate, he ordered the removal of Mr. Wood for no apparent reason. Another bodyguard of stalwart oppositionists was formed around him, and a more violent scuffle took place. The Speaker then pressed a button beneath his desk. Quote from the Sydney Morning Herald report, "At this signal, a posse of heavyweight policemen rushed into the midst of the struggling legislators and parliamentary staff. The crowds in the galleries cheered as the police entered into the melee with great gusto and were soon in possession of the field," unquote. The Herald described it as, quote, "one of the most disgraceful episodes of disorder and confusion that, it is safe to say, have ever been witnessed in any British Parliament," unquote. Others thought it looked more like a scene from a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. With a Liberal Speaker in the chair, Holman had a majority of one on the floor of the House. This majority he lost, however, when one of his members, Mr. Meehan, tripped and catapulted over the balustrade of a staircase one morning in Parliament House. Fortunately, this seriously injured member was granted a pair by the rather aptly named Mr. Fell. But Holman was concerned that the opposition was going to call off the pairing arrangement. So he, again, one step ahead, held a press conference telling the public of this shocking rumour that the opposition was going to show such a savage indifference to parliamentary standards as to deny a member in hospital a pair in Parliament. He said that if they did this, he would wheel Meehan in his hospital bed from the hospital next door to Parliament House into the chamber to vote. Once this was reported in the press, the opposition denied it had any such plans. It's quite likely it never did. Meehan, however, was apparently quite disappointed, as he rather liked the idea of being heroically wheeled into Parliament House to vote to save the day. Around this time, Holman lamented his luck in an after-dinner speech to some accountants. The Sydney Morning Herald reported him saying, quote, "He had studied constitutional history and had never heard of any other parliamentary leader whose entire majority had resigned in a body. Still less likely was it that any other leader, having by great exertion succeeded in re-establishing his majority on a smaller scale, had been confronted with the spectacle of his entire majority falling over the balustrade of a staircase. The constitutional textbooks gave no guide for such action in such unusual circumstances, unquote. Indeed, they don't, but this video does. Holman's luck then turned. The by-election that the opposition had won was later overturned in a court and a new by-election was held. This time, as a consequence of the opposition's unruly and aggressive behaviour in Parliament, it lost public support. Labor won the by-election and restored its majority. It served out the rest of its term and it even won the next election. Among the lessons to be learned from this example are that governors are not rubber stamps. Politicians also need to think at least 3 steps ahead in a crisis with plans for different eventualities. And it's also important to remember that knowledge of parliamentary procedure is extremely important in dealing with a hung parliament. Finally, opposition members should be rather careful about which side of the chamber they happen to fall asleep on during crucial votes and should be aware that the tactic of disruptive behaviour in Parliament can backfire against those who engage in it because they tend to look more like a rabble than an alternative government. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you found this vignette of constitutional history quite interesting, and as always, I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.